Hello, everybody. Welcome back. In this week's lessons, we're going to be talking about functions. Now, functions are not exactly something new. We've seen functions before when we talked about, creating setup, creating window resize, and draw, for example. All of these are functions. You see the keyword over here. When we use commands, when we call functions also that are part of the P5 library, like background over here, this is also a function. When we call a function, basically what it means is we're telling the program, please look up the code that is associated with that function and run it. So we're already kind of familiar with functions, but what we're going to do this week is sort of unpack the syntax a little bit and learn about how we can create our own functions, not necessarily have to rely on predefined events or commands that are included with P5. So we can extend the language and structure our code a little bit however we'd like. This is going to be a little bit of the theme for the coming weeks when we talk about functions and then move into defining our own objects. Now that we know a lot of the basics of programming, so up until now, right, we've covered variables, conditionals, loops, arrays. Those are kind of like your basic building blocks. And then we're going to start talking about functions and objects, which are a little bit more about structure, right? So how do you organize these building blocks into bigger building blocks so that you can then create more interesting programs? So with that out of the way, let's get into it. Now, in order to talk about functions, we're going to do 3 examples this week. The first one is just kind of showing that we can create our own functions. Then we're going to talk about adding parameters to those functions. And then finally, the last example will be about return values. So let's start with just declaring our own functions. And of course, we can't really do this in a vacuum. So we need to create a little bit of an example to work with. So for this program, we're going to always do a bit of a variation on a theme in this series. Let's define here a variable. I'm going to call this a bubble. And what I decided to do for this example, we're going to define this bubble as an object. Okay, so this is a recap of previous weeks, so I'm going to go over this a little bit quickly. And we'll say a bubble is going to have some properties. Okay, an x, a y value, and then let's say a diameter. Okay. And in fact, we don't even need to declare diameter as part of the bubble. It will need variables for speed. So let's just put speed x and speed y because we're going to animate these bubbles. And instead of 0, this is going to be random. Okay? Let's say random between -2 and 2. So they can kind of go in any direction. Okay, so this is all stuff we've done before. And what we're going to do with that bubble is we are going to use it to draw a circle. Okay, and the diameter of that circle is going to be a function of the distance between the bubble's position and where a mouse cursor is located. Excuse me. All right. So let's draw here a bubble using the x and y coordinate of our object. And the diameter, right, we're going to use the inverse of the distance. So the closer the bubble is, the bigger its diameter. As it gets further away from the mouse, we want that diameter to get smaller. So let's define a variable here. I'm going to call this max distance. Okay? And let's say we're going to make this equal to 300. So let's see what that looks like. Okay. Let's hit play and see what that looks like. And I didn't mention it, but I'd already created the boilerplate for this sketch. Okay. So you can see here, obviously I'm at 0, 0. Let's make this random. So it can appear somewhere else. So the behavior we've created is as I get closer, right, to the location, the circle gets bigger. As my mouse gets further away, it gets smaller. And of course, eventually it's going to get negative. And then when you give it a negative value, it just starts to go back up. But we're not going to get to that point quite yet. What we're going to do is going to say when we are far enough away, if the diameter, right, or if the distance is greater than the max distance, Okay, so what's my limit of how far away I want to be. Let's just move it somewhere new. Okay, so so as I get further away, this is going to get moved somewhere new. And in fact, rather than make it random, we are going to move it to the mouse position. All right. So let's try that. Okay. So now as I move my cursor away, when I get 300 pixels away, the bubble is going to follow the mouse position. Okay. So kind of like an interesting little behavior. Now to this, we're going to quickly add some animation, and we know we've created a speed for our object. So our basic animation equation, if you'll remember, right, is simply we say bubble.x plus equal bubble.speedx, and then bubble.y plus equal bubble.speedy. Okay. So this is our basic motion, right? Add the speed to the position. So now this bubble is going to move by itself, right? And then when it gets far away, far enough, it's going to get removed to the location of the mouse cursor. Kind of cool. All right. So let's say we wanted to take this idea here and just create multiples of these, just so we can have more of these objects. Okay? And in fact, it would be interesting here also when the bubble gets far enough away, in addition to bringing it back to the mouse cursor, let's make this random again, just for fun. All right. So now it's going to go back in a different direction every time, just to make it a bit more interesting. So the last little thing we'll do before we finally move into talking about functions is we are going to create multiples of these, right? So instead of just having a single bubble variable here, I would like this to become an array of bubble objects. So let's define a variable here that's going to be an array, and I'm going to call it bubbles, plural, just as I remember. This is an array, but this is not a requirement. And I'm going to comment this out here because we don't need it. In fact, I'm just going to delete it. So if I want these to be elements of an array instead, I could say, let's go and write a for loop. Let's repeat 100 times, let's say. And we're going to put this creation of the object inside the for loop here. Okay. Move it over. And then instead of initializing an individual variable, we are going to initialize a location in our array here. So I'm replacing this with bubbles bracket I. Okay. So this is going to repeat 100 times, and each time a different index will get a different bubble object created. And then in draw, we are going to take this code here, which was operating on a single bubble, and we're going to place it inside a for loop. We're going to say for. Now we have some options here. We could count using an index, or we could use the shorthand syntax. We're going to say bubble of bubbles, okay, where all we want to do, oops, didn't mean to delete that. All we want to do is iterate over the array. We're not really interested in the index here. So let's tidy the code here. So we're going to use this syntax, right? So we're going to create a temporary variable called bubble, which I'm using the same name here so I can reuse my code. I don't have to change anything. So for every bubble object inside my bubbles array, we're going to repeat this little bit of code. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, pretty neat. Let me make one little tweak here. I also kind of find the starting diameter to be a little bit big, so I'm just going to divide this by 2 just to see. All right. So same behavior, but now there's a little bit more breathing room. Okay. So anyways, this is just like an interesting little behavior. It's almost like a simple particle system where we have a number of objects, in this case 100, and we're animating them and giving them a simple behavior. Their behavior here is move in a random direction using the mouse location as your starting point. And when you get far enough away from the mouse, based on this variable, max distance, right? When you get far enough away, just get a new location, a new direction. And then we use that distance to set their size. So it's kind of a fun little animation. All right. So how do we talk about functions from here? Where in this first video, we just want to talk about declaring our own functions, just show that we can do that. We're not going to get into parameters just yet, but we're going to talk about how functions can become reusable blocks of code. Okay? So in this example, for instance, one interesting kind of visual effect that we could do is we could draw this little bunch of bubbles in 2 passes. Right? If we wanted to have, let's say, like an outline around this shape, but not the inner lines, just the outline, I could do this fairly easily by, let's say, just changing my drawing properties here. I could say, if I turned off the fill and then set a stroke, let's say a black stroke, and then a stroke weight of, let's say, 3. Right? I could get this shape, right? And maybe even thicker a little bit. So I could get this shape. And imagine if we took the same set of bubbles and then drew them again on top, right? Except this time we might want to have no stroke and a white fill. Okay? I drew this shape right on top and kind of layered the two together. It would result in me having kind of this interesting outline, black outline around my little cloud bubble thing here. Okay? So that requires drawing every bubble twice. Okay? So we could imagine thinking about, okay, well, what's the code that's drawing the bubble? Well, it's this little bit over here. Okay? So this is drawing the bubbles, and their diameter, we do need the diameter to draw the bubbles. So it would be useful to save that information into the bubble object, because what we're going to do is we're going to create a function. We're going to separate this code out. We're going to have a function that's going to move the bubbles, and then another function that's going to draw the bubbles. Okay? And because the diameter is actually required in both places, the distance, I don't want to calculate this twice necessarily. So let's move this into the object. We're going to define a new property here, diameter, start with 0. And then this is going to become bubble.diameter. Okay. And this is going to become bubble.diameter. Let's run this again. Okay. So now the bubble will remember its diameter. So this whole section of code is all about moving the bubbles. And this section here is about drawing the bubbles. So we're going to create two custom functions to represent this. So the way we create our own functions is basically we use the same syntax as we use to define events and existing functions like setup and draw. We start with a keyword function, and then we give it a name. And the naming rules apply just the same as variables. So same naming rules, and stay away from existing keywords from the language, because if you do that, you're going to kind of overwrite existing functions. But here, for example, I might create a function called move bubbles. Okay? We're going to put some parentheses here, and we're going to leave it empty, just like these. In this video, we're not going to talk about parameters just yet, but we will in the next one. So I'm going to create a function called move bubbles. And then down here, we're going to create another function called draw bubbles. All right. And what we're going to do is take the code inside here and then move it into these two functions. So this little bit over there, right, this is the for loop that's going to iterate over all the bubbles, do the calculations, check if they exceeded the distance, and then move them, so forth. So we're going to take that out and put it into move bubbles. And we're going to remember to close our curly bracket here. So we're going to say tidy code. Perfect. So now we're going to have a function that's going to just animate our bubble objects. And then the drawing code over here, we're going to take that out, move it here, and we still need the for loop. So we're going to copy this bit, move it down there. So we're going to recreate the for loop down here. And in this case, I mean, the drawing bit is fairly straightforward. It's just one line of code, but you could imagine this could get more complex. Okay? So now we have in draw bubbles, we have a for loop that simply goes through the array and then draw every bubbles one at a time. Okay? and we've taken the code out of draw. So if I hit play here, obviously everything is gone because now we've moved the code into these functions that are sitting kind of in the sidelines waiting to be called upon. Okay? So one thing that we can do with functions, even before we talk about parameters and return values, is we can use them to kind of organize our code into different sections. We can give the names that we want to these sections, like move bubbles and draw bubbles. And then whenever we want to run the code that's inside them, we just call the function. So for example, we could now say up here, let's go and call move bubbles. And then down here, we're going to call draw bubbles. Okay? So we're essentially creating our own commands for our program. So now we're back to this little point here. Okay? Now, because we have a command now called draw bubbles, if we wanted to have kind of these two, let's call this pass 1, pass 2, we're going to draw our stuff in 2 passes. The first pass is going to have just the outline, and then the second pass has the fill. Now we can simply say, instead of having to write this again, right, write this code again, we can simply just say draw bubbles. Like so. Now that looks something like this. Let's make it a little bit more dramatic. I'm going to make a thicker outline so we can see it a little bit better. So now what we've done, right, is we've created functions. We've partitioned our code into these different sections. We've given them names like move bubbles and draw bubbles. And whenever we want to run the code, now what we have to do in draw is simply call the name of that function. This is a really powerful idea moving forward, because this is going to help us a lot when it comes to managing complexity in bigger programs. Instead of just having all of our code into draw, maybe some of it into some events as well, we can now start to divide and conquer a little bit. You can see my draw function now has become dramatically simpler, right? And when I read this, it now becomes a lot more straightforward to understand what draw is doing. We're clearing the background, moving some bubbles, right? And then we are changing some attributes here, drawing bubbles, changing the attributes again, drawing the same bubbles one more time. So we've moved code into their own functions, and we've been able to replace that code with words, English words, or whatever language you prefer. So this is really important because now we can manage the complexity of our program a little bit better, right? We're creating our own building blocks that we can reuse, and we can use those to build more interesting programs. Instead of just having one long list of instructions, now we start to create little pockets, little section where we can tuck code away. And that's kind of the first use of functions, right? It's creating our own sections of code that we can then call upon. Okay? Obviously, the architecture of this particular program is not really great, but this is just a simple bit of code here to get us talking about functions. Yeah, so we're going to leave it at that for this example. So now you know that you can define any function that you like, not just the existing ones. You can make up your own names, and inside these functions, you can put whatever code you like. And then when your program is ready to use it, you can just call the function. In the next video, we're going to build on that, and we're going to talk about how do we add parameters. We're going to start to add things inside the parentheses here so that our functions can become customizable. I will see you in the next video.